a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank Carol and I want to thank Elliot for the opportunity to talk to you. What I'm going to talk about is called Sizing Art Up and Down, the issue of quality. As you're all undoubtedly aware, the word quality has become a no-no, a dangerous word to use. Nobody quite knows what it means. Only conservative critics like Clement Greenberg seem to know exactly what it means, and they usually achieve the conception of it by eliminating all the other art that doesn't have any quality. What I'm going to try to do in this talk is to articulate the paradigm of how an art comes to be recognized as having, quote, quality, and we'll keep that word in quotes throughout my presentation. And I want to then talk about why I think this is collapsing now and what the alternative is. In other words, I'm going to talk about the avant-garde conception of quality, or an avant-garde art, which means automatically equal to quality. And then I'm going to talk about what I think is going on right now, a major paradigm change in the conception of how we relate to art based on the collapse of the avant-garde notion of quality. From the beginnings of modernism on, quality has been established by opposition to reigning aesthetic norms, with the once oppositional art itself becoming aestheticized, that is regarded as artistically valid, once it has finally become accepted into the art establishment. Without this resistance to established notions of art, and without the resistance of the establishment to it, the art would lack credibility as art. And this is true of every major avant-garde art so far. It might have token recognition as a cultural artifact, that is, a visual response to particular social circumstances, but not the special status accorded art. But once its contrariness is respected, every detail of its materiality becomes aesthetically resonant. The aura of the art's oppositionality and transgression is reified as its aesthetic quality. This pattern has been repeated ad nauseum in modernity. Every major artist initially presents himself or herself as a little Gandhi standing up to a big empire, or as a terrorist raging against authority, or some combination of the two. I remind you that Poggioli's definition of avant-garde has as its major moment antagonism, and then finally nihilism. Of unassuming but persistent defiance and the outright wish to violate and overthrow the system. Of course, the point is to replace it with the artist's own system, authority, or to find an authoritative place for it within the larger system. Why doesn't the establishment empire kill off its opposition? Perhaps because the opposition taps into its own self-doubt. But also, more importantly, I think, the establishment needs new resources. It is easier to appropriate the vigor of the opposition than rebuild itself from scratch. Easier to assimilate the force of the opposition than to change essential form. It is easier to colonize the opposition. In fact, the opposition wants to be colonized in order to have influence than to deny it, pretend it will go away. As long as some sort of establishment or administration is maintained, as long as some standard is upheld, as long as there seems some way of determining importance in art. Thus, from neoclassical opposition to Rococo art, and many people, scholars regard neoclassicism as the beginning of modernism, through Gauguin's opposition to the European art of his day, and Duchamp's opposition to painting, and on to oppositionality as standard 20th century operating practice, the current stylization of opposition, the basic pattern for the determination of quality in modern art involves opposition to what has already been institutionalized as normative. There is an ongoing search for subject matter and style that seems opposed. Disturbing, subversive, obscene are some code words for opposed. As said, the oppositional art itself eventually becomes, with increasing rapidity, as Leo Steinberg noted, institutionalized. In 1972, in his book Other Criteria, in an essay called Contemporary Art and the Plight of Its Public, the essay was actually published originally in 1962, Leo Steinberg wrote, and I quote, "This rapid domestication of the outrageous is the most characteristic feature of our artistic life, and the time lapse between shock received and thanks returned gets progressively shorter. At the present rate of taste adaptation, it takes about 7 years for a young artist with a streak of wildness in him to turn from enfant terrible into elder statesman. Not so much because he changes, but because the challenge he throws to the public is so quickly met. So then, the shock value of any violently new contemporary style is quickly exhausted. Before long, the new looks familiar, then normal and handsome, finally authoritative," close quote. This was written 3 decades ago. I would myself argue that it takes only 1 season for outrage to become institutionally celebrated. Okay. That's a fact, not the measure of my cynicism. It in turn, that is, this oppositional art, is opposed, overthrown once it's established, or rather asked to move over, if not completely step aside. For opposition needs and depends on company. You have to be opposed to something. The company of what it opposes. It must make room for the new opposition, soon to become yet another measure of quality. What was up is pushed down, or at least diminished in the quality of its upness. It becomes unexpectedly dull, boring, by the art aspiring to be up. If only unconsciously, like Duchamp, who supposedly wanted to knock art down as object, concept, social reality, but continued to make it. Would he have been happier doing something else? And I focus on Duchamp a little bit throughout this because he's a key example of what I'm talking about. Would he have been happier doing something else? Why did he feel compelled to hold on to the idea that he was an artist? Did he find a novel prestige and authority in it? The last foothold, maybe stronghold, of his self-belief. To reiterate, the new up art loses its hegemony in turn, and sooner or later the recurrent pattern, the eternal return of the opposed, reveals itself as an insidious leveler, an increasingly long row of ups, all alike in their upness, is challenged by a truculent down, which wants to be another up, wants the other ups to make room for it in the pantheon of ups. Substitution of an old up by a new up is not the issue, but the displacement of the quality of upness from the old oppositional art to the new one. However, the rather predictable, almost systematic way the displacement of the quality of upness from one oppositional to another art occurs in an increasingly incestuous way, slowly but surely erodes our sense of its significance. It comes to seem irrelevant in the process of art history, and finally meaningless in itself. Indeed, the distinction between an up and a down art comes to seem dubious, absurd, a false way of understanding the relations between different kinds of art, even though they continue to compete for the up place of honor and power, putting the other down in the process. All finally come to exist, like so many pearls on a string, their genuineness impossible to determine at a glance. For all first had to have been down to become up, irregular to become one of the regulars, so that it becomes increasingly unclear whether it is more genuine to be down than up, since the downs want to be up, and the ups had to have once been down. It seems that all an artist has to do is to be opposed to the establishment, that is, put it down, to be sooner or later incorporated into it. This makes one wonder if opposition has come to be nothing more, still a little bit more, than a strategy of belonging. There may be arguments as to who is at the top of the heap, but those are secondary to how one became an accepted part of it. Issues of status in the hierarchy are secondary to the issue of first winning a place for oneself in it, which guarantees one the status of becoming part of the discourse, to use the fashionable parlance. One might say that there are two senses of hierarchy at stake. One, the hierarchy of insider-outsider, with the insider assumed to be up and the outsider assumed to be down, and the outsider rising up when he becomes an insider by opposing one or more already existing insiders, and 2, the hierarchy of up-down within what is consensually assumed to be the establishment. Primacy in the one tends to be more fluid than primacy in the other. That is, in the avant-garde situation of art, it is easier to get into the establishment, strange as that may seem, than to change one's assigned place within it once one belongs. You get in by making a stand against it. In my opinion, the substance of the stand matters less than the fact that it is cognitively dissonant with one or more of the accepted values of the establishment. That is, its major import is that it seems to be different, supposedly radically different, from the various samenesses that inhabit the establishment. What counts is that it sets up a jarring note of disidentity within an establishment that regards itself as self-identical, even though that is far from the case. For the modern system of art is a sum of differences that do not add up to a whole, or rather add up to a nominal whole, in that all the types of art in it have one salient thing in common. They all belong to the system, are all acceptable within it. They have gotten their credentials and membership by going the distance of opposition, enduring the outer wilderness of the marginality, that is, until they suddenly get the call from the system. Hang on, it'll come sooner or later. They are taken in, having proved themselves in the desert of outsiderness. Indeed, it is the vitality and staying power demonstrated by this long-suffering outsiderness that the establishment wants to appropriate for itself, assimilate for its own survival purpose. It gives it its generalized authority, it gives its generalized authority to a particular outsider art as though that will rejuvenate it from within. I think a very good example of this happened recently in Washington, with the purchase of the Hempel Folk Art collection by the National Collection of Art. Here we have a completely marginal art, indeed modern, that is contemporary folk art, taken into the establishment, a major museum, the Smithsonian, one of the Smithsonian museums. And so this art, which was very outsider, and many people think it's not art, suddenly becomes art because the institution appropriates it. For the establishment, new oppositional art, and that makes the establishment feel very good. You know, it's become alive again. For the establishment, new oppositional art is something like monkey glands or lamb embryos. Taken into the system's body politic, the new art gives the system a new lease on life, new strength. Indeed, it is a matter of principle that, up to a pre-revolutionary point, the more opposition to the establishment, the more it flourishes. For the opposition indicates that the system is still regarded as powerful. Just when it begins to think of itself as old and tired, the opposition makes it realize it is still strong. Nietzsche has a wonderful discussion of something similar where he talks about how real power tolerates its enemies, even cultivates them, brings them forward. It wants enemies. It relishes opposition. The establishment reciprocates by welcoming the opposition as its fresh young blood. The opposition serves as a revitalizing transfusion of energy within the same old body politic. It is worth noting that Duchamp kept inventing new variations of cognitive dissonance as though compulsively repeating his original act of opposition, as though to recover the glorious moment of his first magical opposition to the establishment, and as though renewing his outsiderness, his rejection of the establishment. Each renewal, in fact, strengthening his position in the establishment, giving him new power in it, one indicator of which is that he spawned innumerable followers, in fact, founding an academy, becoming an establishment in himself. Duchamp truly perfected the strategy of achieving near dictatorial power in the system by consistent opposition to it. By making the establishment feel insecure with some predictability, Duchamp made himself more secure within it. He is one of the reasons why the system of modern art has come to regard the avant-garde strategy of opposition to it as fun rather than anxiety-arousing. Or rather, the establishment has learned that a little anxiety can be stimulating reinvigorating ego syntonic. My point is this: determinations of quality occur within a quite objectifiable horizon of expectations, to quote Hans Robert Jauss, the famous theorist of reception aesthetics. And of modern necessity, art accorded quality is expected to stand in opposition to conventional psychosocial expectations. Thus, the course modern determinations of quality take is in large measure predictable. It is predetermined by oppositionality. When certain powers that be in the art world say that they are opposed to quality and or aesthetics, for example, the Alternative Museum or the New Museum of Contemporary Art, so-called alternative spaces, saying they do know what it means, and I'm speaking of Marcia Tucker particularly, who said she didn't, was not interested in quality. Lawrence Alloway, when he was alive, said that also. When they say this, they are assuming that it in fact represents institutional system values to which they are opposed. But oppositionality or anti-establishmentism has also become an establishment. Indeed, there are flourishing institutions devoted to official, I want to emphasize that, official oppositional art, such as the New Museum of Contemporary Art and the Alternative Museum, and every establishment museum has its token opposition art exhibitions. It is often assumed that anything significantly contemporary is vaguely oppositional, and it is in fact a necessary part of the larger dialectic of the system. This involves the establishment, opposition to it, and incorporation of the opposition into the establishment, giving it authority, prestige, outreach. Now, I want to suggest that this entire dialectic that I've just described in a kind of nutshell has broken down or is in the process of breaking down. It has become all too clear that both the establishment and the opposition want the same thing. The differences between them count for less than their common pursuit of power. Both want power to determine artistic norms. In theory, that is, my ideas are right, yours are wrong, and practice, I have the right to exhibit, to be written about, you don't. They want the power to control history, to write it their way, and to exclude from it whomever does not follow their party line. They want totalitarian power, that is, the power to totalize the system, absolute authority over it. More crucially, both the system and the opposition work the same way. Both have become manipulatively bureaucratic. Artistic quality today, whether officially heterodox or orthodox, is no longer individuated charismatically, but pre-rationalized and pre-socialized, as it were. Indeed, charismatic artistic individuality has become a media strategy, communicating a facile sense of what it is to be both individual and an artist. One no doubt true to the sense prevailing in the society at large. The conception of the artist as a media cult figure has undermined the conception of the artist as the exemplary instance of true selfhood, the conception of the artist as a person of quality, which used to be the old notion. I am even ready to go so far, maybe absurdly too far, as to say that no work of art today spontaneously conveys the charisma of autonomy, that is, creates the illusion that it is the independent product of an independent individual responding flexibly rather than compulsively to a system. The old idea of quality was embedded in this idea of the charismatic, autonomous work of art. Works of art today are qualityless, because the old idea of the work of art has changed and because the dialectic of establishment opposition has become a sham. Andy Warhol's art and persona are important signifiers of this. Correlate with this development of what I call the qualityless work of art, which is very much like what Robert Musil called the man without quality, very important conception of Musil, the novelist. One cannot trust one's autonomous, direct reaction to the work of art, because the quality of that reaction is as pre-designed by the system as the work of art. Once one believes in the system, be it that of the opposition or establishment, one's response to it tends to be as authoritarian as it is. That is, the system being a total system of art, in fact, the system is the real work of art, in my opinion, comes complete with built-in interpretations of art. The work of art comes pre-interpreted these days, falls into this category, that category, or with the limits of interpretation preset, which is the same thing. All one's so-called autonomous direct response to it does is fall in line with the prescribed possibilities of interpretation. What the philosopher John Dewey once wrote in his very important book, Artist's Experience, quote, "Criticism is a search for the properties of the object that may justify the direct reaction," close quote. What Dewey wrote is obsolete and may have been naive to begin with, for it seems that every instinctive and interpretive reaction to the work of art is as much a product of the system as the work of art more obviously is. The system knows how to use the primary processes of the unconscious as well as the secondary process of consciousness, that is, instinct and theory, to get one to invest in certain art. Dewey's conception of criticism as evaluation, which involves what he called the venture of a hypothesis about the work of art, posits a heuristic freedom in the understanding of it that does not exist. The work of art, our interpretive hypotheses about it, and our direct, intimate reactions to it are bureaucratically manipulated down to their least detail. Art no longer simply reflects the system and its limits, as was once thought and was in a sense true. Rather, the total system of art, which necessarily includes oppositional art, is pre-produced as a closed system. Oppositional art is simply one kind of foreordained critical feedback within the system. And the system, I might say, must be minimally binary, that is, have an establishment and an opposition, an up and a down, a top dog and underdog, to be structured in work. Artists who oppose the establishment and who attempt to control our direct reaction to and interpretation of their art are simply playing their prescribed part in the system. Artists have been militantly telling us the meaning of their art since the first manifestos, in part to obscure the fact that they cannot be certain of its meaning in an age of relativity of meaning, and in part to convince us of the art's superlative significance, that is, to compel us to overestimate it. But if the binary system of establishment opposition has indeed broken down, if it in fact has been leveled, so that what counts is what the establishment and the opposition have in common rather than difference between them, if this is the case, then if this breakdown leaves us in the new situation of quality-less art, then direct reaction might have a new lease on life. And this is the heart of my thesis in this paper. It now becomes the tip of a different kind of iceberg. Instead of a pawn in the dialectical game of establishment opposition, it becomes the harbinger and prophet of subjectivity. Jauss points out, quote, that the psychic process, this is a quote, in the reception of an art is by no means only an arbitrary series of merely subjective impressions, but rather the carrying out of specific instructions in a process of directed perception, close quote. However, if we realize that our perception, indeed our psychic process, is directed in a predictable way by the predetermined avant-garde dialectic of establishment opposition, that in a sense the instructions of perception are fixed by this dialectic, we cannot help but reject them. That is, we awaken to such a realization only when we recognize the bankruptcy of the avant-garde dialectic. This is not simply out of routine cynicism, but because this realization is implicitly a spontaneous recovery of autonomy, and as such a call for independence of judgment and perception. It is a refusal to let our psychic process be instructed by a bankrupt, self-betraying system. We refuse to be taken in by it, to follow its dictates, to endure its psychomoral debacle any longer, to believe in and interpret the art it presents to us in the way we are supposed to. And so we are forced back on what Jauss called the arbitrary series of merely subjective impressions that are anathema to the system, that it promised to transcend with its historical objectivity, interpretive rationality, and documentation of expectations. But what are subjective impressions? They, in fact, are hardly arbitrary and hardly trivial, that is, not merely subjective, especially not in the situation of the bankruptcy of the avant-garde dialectic of establishment opposition and its production of quality-less art. The critic's subjective impressions signify the force of his desire for art. No longer believing in the fraudulent dialectic that produces quality-less art, the critic realizes that only his desire for art can give it quality. The quality of his desire for quality-less art, his wishful relationship with it, renews its quality. Its quality can no longer follow from its objective oppositionality, but from the critic's subjective investment in it. Thus, the critic's recognition of the bankruptcy and irrelevance of the dialectic of establishment opposition is his initial declaration of independence from the system. He loses faith in its ideas about art, that is, its prescribed modes of interpretation, usually justifying an art's supposed oppositionality, difference from, and subversion of establishment art. After this liberating skepticism, the critic realizes that he has only his investment of desire in a particular art to fall back on. He uses this desire heuristically. It is an empathic antenna trying to pick up the aura of desire the art emits, trying to tune in to the desire embedded in the art. It is understood, that is, art is understood only as an objectification of desire. Not only is avant-garde desire not necessarily oppositional, but the apparent oppositionality of avant-garde art usually masks deeper, less obvious desires. I reiterate, only by viewing quality-less art under the auspices of desire can it be seen as having quality in the post-avant-garde situation, in which, to reiterate yet again, the dialectic of establishment opposition has become a farce, no longer a source of artistic legitimacy. The critic then makes what I call judgments of desire. That is, he examines the reasons he desires in art and the character of the desire implicit in the art. Ultimately, he must uncover the reasons he desires art as such, regards it as essential to life. The critical analysis of the desire for a particular art is frequently retrospective and corrective. That is, it usually occurs after the critic has shown his spontaneous desire for an art by intellectually attending to it. He examines the reasons he did so, partly for reasons of general subjective hygiene, partly to determine whether he wants to continue to invest in the art, partly to detach himself from it so that he can invest in other arts. Criticism is necessarily promiscuous if it is to do justice to the scene. But my main point is that only the desire for an art can give it avant-garde quality in its post-avant-garde state of qualitylessness. In general, we tend to relate to art for spontaneous, if unconscious, subjective reasons before we relate to it consciously for objective reasons. Indeed, we use the latter to repress or deny the former. It is supposed to be Philistine to acknowledge the subjective dimension of one's basic investment in art, but the fact of the matter is that it is inescapable, and if not analyzed, blinds one to the art's own subjective dimension. And I firmly believe that art is basically a subjective product. It has no propositional truth character, no propositional character to it. That is, it makes no statements about reality. What leads us to seriously attend to an art and investigate it in intellectual depth has to do with some unacknowledged depth of emotional response to it. The so-called direct reaction to art that John Dewey spoke of is the inarticulate sign of the investment implied by this response. It is no doubt difficult to disentangle the various aspects of one's investment in art, which is why it appears obscure and inchoate at first introspection. However, it has certain general characteristics which inform our particular spontaneous judgment of the art. They amount to emotional biases, as it were, and can never be overcome by the truth of the work, as Gadamer thinks, German hermeneutical thinker. Rather, that truth must cater to them. It must also serve desire before it can begin to be respected in its own right, if it can be understood as ever completely independent of desire. To fall back on subjectivity in evaluating art is not to betray its truth, but to recognize that this truth, the truth of art, must serve our psyches if it is to be completely valid. More precisely, it is invariably a kind of intervention in our psyches. That's the way I think of art. The question is whether that is for good or bad. Indeed, much criticism is motivated by the wish to show that an art which does not initially seem to be good for the psyche, in fact, subtly is. There should be a criticism showing that art which seems to be good for the psyche is in fact harmful. The basic modern debate on art, the question of whether it exists for its own sake or for that of life, revolves around it. The debate is traceable at least to Baudelaire's rejection of so-called art for art's sake. In fact, art for art's sake serves the psyche in an important way. More than any other art, it serves what Erich Fromm calls our need for transcendence of our creatureliness, facilitated by objects of devotion. The evaluation of art in terms of its psychic surface can be regarded as what Gadamer calls a legitimate prejudice. I think it is an inescapable basic one. Freud no doubt simplified matters when he spoke of art as substitute psychosexual gratification. I have elsewhere argued that it can be interpreted in terms of basic psychic needs for relatedness, following Fromm's conception of them. Here, I want to argue that to emphasize the importance of one's unconscious subjective relationship to art in any evaluation of it is to attempt to rescue desire from a semiotic reading of art, including the prevailing avant-garde interpretation of it as essentially oppositional. Not that desire needs rescuing. It clearly can look out for itself, assert itself in myriad subtle signs, being much more cunning than reason. Rather, the skeptical critic unexpectedly finds himself full of excess desire for art, desire that seems bigger than its object, desire to spare, to kill, as it were, because the entire system of presenting and representing art has become fraudulent to him. What I am talking about can be more clearly understood in terms of Freud's idea, I quote, and I'm quoting from a Freudian named William Barrett, not Freud directly, I quote, that mental life is composed not only by systems of semioses, that is, a lawful and ordered totality of signs, such as traces, images, symbols, percepts, categories, beliefs, etc., but also as a movement bearing the impulsions of something that is not itself significatory, namely desire, which is like a mysterious energy, a temporality moving through, yet occluded by, the structuring of signs. Mental life is founded upon the contradictoriness of these dimensionalities, that is, semiosis and desire. I think that the art we come to regard as ultimately significant, that is, art of so-called eternal value, the art we install in the most imaginary museum of all, the mental space of the eternal present, bespeaks desire. That is, it functions to symbolize eternal desire, as it were. eternal desire stands above all transient systems of meaning, that is, systems of semiosis, even as it helps construct them. Each attempt to isolate, articulate, and finally reify one of its aspects, desire eventually sweeps them away as inadequate to it. When Jauss compares the reception of Flaubert's Madame Bovary and Feydeau's Fanny, the former now enshrined in the pantheon of eternal presence, but censored when it appears, the latter, more popular on appearance, has come to be regarded as only of symptomatic interest and as a social artifact rather than transcendent art. Transcendent art would be a transformation, as it were, of eternal desire. When, as I say, Jauss compares these two works, he is in effect comparing a work, that is Flaubert's, which seems a new statement of desire, with one which enters an established system of semiosis. In this case would be the semiosis of Eros. Flaubert's work erupted within and disrupted this system, while eventually being assimilated by it after initial resistance and repression. But his novel can still seem eternally new and fresh, transcending all previous readings of it, which is what it means to say it is eternally present. It is this newness that I believe Gadamer is alluding to, however unwittingly, when he spoke of the interpreter as having to, quote, be sensitive to the newness and truth of art, however old the art was. Now, opposition, this thing called opposition, was once desire in rebellion against the existing semiosis of art. And I think that's the way you can understand it from Courbet, Manet, the Impressionists, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cubism, Dadaism, Mondrian. But it has become, after much repetition and assimilation of all its repetitions, a standard semiosis, or system of meaning. To put this another way, opposition has become stagnant desire and a dead system of meaning, undynamic desire and a rigid, all too limited semiosis of art. Where the establishment represented a fixed structure of semiosis, which the avant-garde opposition disrupted, intervened in a call for a new truth of desire, this dialectic has become a predetermined fixed semiotic system. That is, it has become avant-gardistic rather than avant-garde. In such a situation, in which all oppositional artists, and they are the prevailing kind, are necessarily enslaved, the critic's role, which he finds himself in because he recognizes that the oppositional semiosis of art has become enslaving and he wishes to break free of it, the critic's role is that of apostle of free desire. No doubt the critic will fall into the paradox of having to use one or more of the various semioses of desire, such as Freud's, if he is not to become unreadable, that is, the victim of his own desire. Clearly, he will have to analyze the various semioses of desire, that is, the kinds of meaning given to desire, as critically as the meaning of oppositionality. Nonetheless, the critic's doubt of the entire dialectical structure of modern art forces him to try to excavate the desire invested in it and to evaluate its products in terms of the desire invested in them. In general, the critic comes to represent the force of desire in art against the power of the system to read and form it to its own end, which invariably involves its rationalization and reification. The judgment of desire the critic passes on art liberates it from self-satisfied readings of it. The critic values art that possesses a quality of desire that seems to undo the system from within, making it seem at odds with itself in unexpected subjective way. Such an art suggests the subject's unhappy, restless desire. Its dissatisfaction makes it seem to exist in a pure state. Thank you.